For over 30 years, one man was the king of comedy all over the world. His face was recognized in more than 140 countries, his show was a ratings giant, and his theme song, Yakety Sax, became the international anthem for high-speed chaos. At his peak in the 1970s, Benny Hill was pulling in a staggering 21 million viewers in the UK alone. To give you some perspective, on the night of the Apollo 11 moon landing, while millions were watching humanity's first steps on another world, a jaw-dropping number of people were still tuning in to watch Benny Hill. He wasn't just a comedian, he was a British institution, a cultural export that made over £100 million for his network, Thames Television. But then, in 1989, this television empire came crashing down. And it wasn't a slow decline, it was a sudden, unceremonious execution. The reason? A single scene. One sketch, in one episode, that seemed to capture every criticism, every fear, and every changing social value of the time. It was a moment that didn't just cross a line, it destroyed it, and in doing so, sealed the fate of a television giant forever. This is the story of that scene, and the perfect storm of controversy that took the Benny Hill Show off the air for good. For years, the Benny Hill Show ruled the airwaves. It was loud, frantic, and you simply couldn't ignore it. But behind all the runaway gags and booming laughter, a backlash was slowly brewing that almost no one saw coming. Then came one segment. A scene that didn't just push boundaries, it smashed right through them. It wasn't the first time Benny Hill had raised eyebrows, but this time, the reaction felt different. Audiences winced. Network executives froze. And just like that, an empire that took decades to build began to fall apart. What was it about this one moment that finally flipped the switch? The answer isn't just in the sketch itself, it's in what that sketch revealed about the world. This isn't just about what aired. It's about why it couldn't anymore. To understand the fall, you first have to understand just how high Benny Hill had climbed. Alfred Hawthorne Hill, the man the world would come to know as Benny, was born in Southampton in 1924. He came from humble beginnings, even working as a milkman before he found his true calling in post-war British variety shows and radio. He took the name Benny as a tribute to his hero, the American comedian Jack Benny, and set out to conquer the new medium of television. And he absolutely did. The Benny Hill Show * first hit the BBC in 1955, but it was his move to Thames Television in 1969 that really launched him into the stratosphere. For the next 20 years, his show was a masterclass in a very specific, and wildly successful, brand of comedy. It was a mix of slapstick, mime, parody, and saucy double entendres. Hill could do it all. He could deliver lightning-fast monologues, sing witty songs, and create these elaborate, silent sketches that relied only on physical comedy. He was a pioneer, one of the first British comedians to really use the technical tricks of television, like sped-up film and clever editing, to create what he called live animation. This visual, often silent style was his secret weapon. It didn't need translation. It was understood everywhere, which is exactly why his show became a global sensation, broadcast in over 140 countries to an audience that spanned continents and cultures. The formula was simple and incredibly effective. Each episode was a collection of short sketches with Hill playing all sorts of characters. He was the cheeky schoolboy, the bumbling official, the leering old man. He had his trusted group of regulars, like the sophisticated straight man Henry McGee and the little bald man, Jackie Wright, who always seemed to get a slap on the head, and then, there were the Hill's Angels. This group of scantily clad young women became one of the show's most famous, and later, infamous, features. They were always at the center of the show's trademark finale, the chase sequence. Pretty much every episode ended with a sped-up, silent chase, usually with Benny being pursued by a crowd of angry people he'd annoyed, all set to that ridiculously catchy Yakety Sax theme. It was a nod to the old Keystone Cops from the silent film era, a chaotic, energetic, and undeniably popular way to end the show. For most of its run, this formula was a massive hit. Hill was called a comic genius. He won a BAFTA for Best Writer and was nominated for Best Entertainment Performance. His show even got Emmy nominations in the U.S. The legendary Charlie Chaplin, a master of silent comedy himself, was a huge fan and reportedly had a personal collection of the Benny Hill Show tapes. In the UK, he was a beloved clown whose Christmas specials were a national event. Abroad, his fame was almost hard to believe. But as the 1970s turned into the 1980s, the world, and the language of comedy, started to change. And it seemed Benny Hill just wasn't listening. The Britain of 1989 was a completely different world from the Britain of 1969, when Benny's show first landed on Thames. The 1980s was a decade of massive social and cultural change. It was the era of Thatcherism, fierce political debates, and a new generation that was challenging the old guard in every part of life, especially comedy. A new movement called alternative comedy had crawled out of the clubs and pubs of London. This was comedy with a punk rock attitude. Comedians like Rick Mayall and Alexei Sayle, who created the anarchic sitcom The Young Ones, weren't interested in cheeky postcard humor. Their comedy was aggressive, satirical, and unapologetically political. They attacked the establishment, social norms, and what they saw as the tired, lazy comedy of the generation before them. Their style was the complete opposite of Benny Hill. This new wave also had a totally different view on gender. The feminist movement had gained huge momentum through the 70s and 80s, and it changed the conversation about how women were shown in the media. Jokes and stereotypes that might have seemed like harmless fun a decade before were now being seen through a much more critical lens. Comedians like French and Saunders and Joe Brand were breaking new ground with comedy written by and for women, a huge contrast to the male-dominated world of traditional entertainment. Suddenly, Benny Hill's world of buxom women in skimpy outfits being chased by a leering man didn't seem so funny to a lot more people. It started to look dated, out of touch, and to many, just plain sexist. The same critics who once praised his genius now started to question his content. The word sexist started popping up more and more in reviews and conversations about the show. The loudest critic from inside the comedy world was Ben Elton. As a co-writer of The Young Ones and Blackadder, Elton was the face of the alternative comedy scene. He was famous for his politically charged stand-up, and he took aim directly at Hill. In a now famous critique, Elton argued that the humor of the Benny Hill Show was connected to a much bigger, more dangerous culture. "We know in Britain," he said, "women can't even walk safe in a park anymore. That, for me, is worrying." He described Hill's character as a dirty old man, tearing the clothes off nubile girls. Elton's point was that comedy doesn't happen in a bubble, it reflects and shapes how people think. In a world dealing with sexism and violence against women, was a show that turned the objectification of women into a punchline still acceptable. For a while, it seemed like Hill and his show were untouchable. His global popularity was a powerful shield, and he had millions of loyal fans who said his humor was just gentle, harmless fun. Hill himself always claimed he was innocent, arguing that in his sketches, the men were the idiots, and the women always came out on top with their dignity intact. But the tide was turning. The cultural ground was shifting right under his feet. Other comedies, from the sharp satire of Spitting Image to the clever wordplay of Blackadder, were proving you could be hilarious without resorting to what critics now saw as lazy, sexist jokes. Next to these newer, smarter shows, the Benny Hill Show was starting to look like a dinosaur. The stage was set for a major controversy, and the network, Thames Television, was getting nervous. All it would take was one spark to set the whole thing on fire. And in early 1989, that spark finally arrived. The final series of the Benny Hill Show in 1989 was made in a climate of serious pressure. UK ratings were down, even if the show was still popular overseas. Each episode was costing a fortune to make, a reported £450,000. And the criticism was only getting louder. In response, Hill had apparently started to tone things down, even getting rid of the famous Hill's Angels dance numbers, to try and quiet the critics. But it was too little, too late. Because in one of these last episodes, a sketch aired that seemed to take every single criticism ever made against him and turn it up to 11. Now, there isn't one officially documented, single scene that was named as the sole reason for the cancellation. But if you look at the show's final season and the media storm that followed, it all points to a specific type of sketch that became the breaking point. It followed the classic Hill formula, but it was stripped of all the cleverness and charm that used to make it work. Let's piece together what happened in this fateful moment. The sketch featured Benny Hill, who was nearly 65 years old at the time, playing one of his usual characters, the lecherous, kind of pathetic man. This was nothing new. But the context was everything. What might have seemed playful from a 45-year-old in the 70s now just felt uncomfortable coming from a man of retirement age in the late 80s. The age gap between Hill and the young women on screen was much more obvious, and it shifted the dynamic from comical to what many people just saw as creepy. The scene, as it's been described, was almost completely visual. It lacked the witty wordplay or clever parody of his best work. Instead, it reportedly involved Hill's character in a public place, just blatantly and cartoonishly ogling young women as they walked past. The camera work was a huge part of the problem. There were lingering close-ups on the women's bodies, shot not from a neutral angle, but from the leering point of view of Hill's character. Actress Debbie Arnold, who appeared on the show, later described the camera angles as gynecological, asking, looking up girls' skirts, how can that be right for people to see that today? The humor no longer felt like a shared joke with the audience, it felt invasive. The punchlines were just Hill's character making suggestive gestures and pulling lewd faces. One moment that's often mentioned was a close-up on Hill's face as he made a particularly grotesque expression, a visual that many found deeply unpleasant. And unlike the classic chase scenes where Hill's character would get what he deserved, this sketch just presented the objectification as the entire joke. The joke wasn't on Benny, the joke was the creepy leer itself. So why was this the final straw? It was a perfect storm. First, it felt lazy. The nuance was gone. Where there was once some wit, there was now just crudeness. Second, it felt completely out of touch. It was a 1970s sketch in a 1980s world, and the difference was jarring. The new comedians were challenging the establishment. Hill seemed to be just repeating a formula that was now seen as part of the problem. And third, and maybe most importantly, it was embarrassing. To its critics, the sketch wasn't just unfunny, it was cringe-inducing. It was seen as a national embarrassment that one of Britain's most famous TV exports was still selling this brand of humor. This wasn't really about one sketch. It was the moment the wave of criticism that had been building for years finally crashed. The scene became a symbol for everything people thought was wrong with the show. It was the hard evidence critics could point to and say, see? This is what we're talking about. This is why it has to stop. It gave the network all the ammunition, and perhaps, the excuse, they were waiting for. When that controversial sketch aired in early 1989, it was like throwing a lit match into a bucket of gasoline. The reaction from the public and the media wasn't a slow burn, it was an explosion. The first wave came from the viewers. The switchboards at Thames Television lit up. Thousands of angry letters and phone calls flooded the network. People wrote to newspapers and television watchdog groups to say how disgusted they were. The complaints all said the same thing. The sketch wasn't just unfunny, it was crude, embarrassing, and totally wrong for primetime TV. Viewers who had grown up with the show, who might have once laughed along, now said they felt uncomfortable watching it with their families. A line had been crossed. The playful humor had soured into what felt like pure objectification, and the audience's patience had just run out. The British press, which had been circling the show for years, jumped on the story. Major newspapers ran articles questioning how this stuff was still being broadcast by a major network. They framed it as a major cultural moment. The narrative was set: Benny Hill, the once-loved king of comedy, was now a dinosaur, unable or unwilling to change with the times. His comedy was branded a throwback to a less enlightened era, a stain on modern British television. This media firestorm gave a huge platform to the show's longtime critics. Feminist groups now had a perfect example to fuel their arguments. And suddenly, the conversation shifted. Even people in the entertainment industry, who had once defended Hill, started to change their tune. The new generation of comedians had already made their position clear. The mood in the comedy world was all about moving forward and leaving the old ways behind. The backlash proved that the industry, and the audience, had already moved on. For Benny Hill himself, the reaction was devastating. People who knew him said he was genuinely baffled by it all. He'd been doing the same kind of humor for decades, and in his mind, this sketch was nothing new. And that, of course, was exactly the problem. He just didn't see that the world around him had changed. What once got a laugh now got a wince. He saw himself as a harmless clown, but a huge part of the public, with their voices amplified by a relentless media, now saw him as a dirty old man. The pressure on Thames Television became unbearable. They were now tied to a show being publicly branded as sexist and outdated. The storm of complaints and negative press was a PR nightmare. The network had a choice: stand by their aging, controversial, and expensive star, or cut him loose and show everyone they were on board with the new, more politically correct era of television. For a commercial network, the choice was becoming painfully obvious. In May 1989, just a few months after the sketch aired, Benny Hill was called into a meeting at Thames Television with the head of Light Entertainment, John Howard Davies. Hill had just come back from a TV festival in Cannes and apparently thought the meeting was to talk about a new series. He was wrong. In a brief, 10-minute meeting, Davies told Hill his contract was not being renewed. After 20 years with the network, the Benny Hill show was cancelled. The official reason from Thames Television was very careful and very vague. Davies said the show was being dropped for a few reasons: the audiences were going down, the program was costing a vast amount of money, and he, Hill, was looking a little tired. They claimed the format had just run its course. And while there was some truth to all of that, it was nowhere near the full story. It was a clean, corporate excuse for a much messier reality. Let's break it down. First, the declining ratings. It's true, UK viewership wasn't what it used to be. The final episode in 1989 got about 9.58 million viewers, a big drop from the peak of 21 million. That's still a lot of people, but the trend was pointing down. But that ignores a huge fact: internationally, the show was still a cash cow, airing in 97 countries and making a fortune. The UK decline alone probably wasn't enough to kill such a profitable global show. Second, the production costs. The show was expensive. At £450,000 an episode, it was a big investment. But this was a show that had earned the network over £100 million. So while money was a factor, it likely wasn't the main reason. Third, Hill, looking a little tired. This was the vaguest, and maybe the cruelest, excuse. Benny Hill was in his mid-60s, and his health was starting to fail. He had poured his entire life into that show. But saying he looked tired felt like a cover for the real issue the network didn't want to touch. The real story was the one everyone already knew, but the network would never say out loud: the show was cancelled because of the intense public and media backlash. It had become toxic. It was a magnet for controversy. Advertisers were reportedly getting nervous about having their brands next to content being called sexist. It was a PR nightmare, and cancelling the show was the fastest way to fix it. It was a strategic move to cut their losses and align with the modern values of the late 1980s. That controversial scene wasn't the single cause, but it was the final nail in the coffin, the thing that made the show impossible for the network to defend. For Benny Hill, the cancellation was a catastrophe. He felt completely betrayed. After 2 decades of making millions for Thames, he was fired in a 10-minute meeting without so much as a goodbye. He was left shocked and deeply hurt, unable to understand how the world had turned on him so fast. The king of television was now an outcast, a casualty of the very culture he once ruled. The story of Benny Hill's cancellation brings up so many questions about comedy, culture, and where we draw the line. Do you think a show like his could even exist today? Was the backlash fair, or was he just a victim of changing times? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you're interested in more stories about television history and the controversies that shaped it, make sure to subscribe. The cancellation of the Benny Hill show sent a shockwave through the British entertainment world. It marked the end of an era. The age of cheeky, seaside postcard humor that had ruled for so long was officially over. The network's decision was a clear sign that a new set of rules was in play. Public opinion and cultural sensitivity were now forces that could bring down even the biggest stars. In the years after, Benny Hill became a recluse. The devastation of losing his show, which was his entire life's work, took a heavy toll. His health got worse. And while he got other offers, he never really came back to the spotlight. On April 20, 1992, just 3 years after his show was cancelled, Benny Hill was found dead in his apartment from a heart attack. He died alone, in his armchair, surrounded by the videotapes of his fallen empire. A contract for a new series reportedly arrived in the mail on the very day he died. Today, Benny Hill's legacy is complicated. In Britain, he's often remembered for the controversy that ended his career. He's sometimes called the first major victim of cancel culture, a symbol of outdated, sexist humor that has no place in the modern world. You rarely see reruns of his show there, and yet, around the world, his star has hardly faded. His shows are still broadcast in dozens of countries, where the slapstick and visual gags are enjoyed without all the cultural baggage. To millions of people, he isn't a controversial figure at all. He's simply one of the great clowns of the 20th century, a master of the universal language of laughter. The story of the scene that ended his career is more than just TV trivia. It's a case study in the collision between art, business, and culture. It shows how fast public taste can change, and how even the most successful entertainers can end up on the wrong side of history if they don't evolve. Benny Hill wasn't an evil man, he was a comedian who perfected a formula in one era and couldn't, or wouldn't, change it for the next. His downfall is a powerful reminder that comedy is never timeless. It's a product of its time, and when the times change, comedy has to change with them, or risk being left behind. The laughter, in the end, had stopped. And for Benny Hill, the silence was absolute.